The world didn't collapse in fire, it ran out of fuel. When the lights went out and the engines stopped, humanity faced its most desperate hour. What happens when survival means conscription, and loyalty is measured in liters? Stick around till the end, and if this story pulls you in, hit subscribe for more world-shaking tales that make you question how close fiction really is to our future. It started with the numbers on the news ticker, quiet, harmless, just digits and decimals trickling down like sand through an hourglass. The global fuel reserves had dropped below 20%, and no one panicked, not at first. People laughed at the idea of running out of gasoline, mocked the headlines about the great shortage, as if it were another media stunt. But when the first power grids collapsed across Europe, when airliners were grounded, and refineries went silent, laughter turned to silence, and silence turned to fear. Governments across continents called it the fuel situation, as though softening the name could lessen the catastrophe. Behind those sterile words lay chaos, empty highways, frozen supply chains, darkened cities, and a population unprepared for a world that suddenly couldn't move. Then came the draft. At first, it was just volunteers. Young men and women promised extra rations, small fuel credits, maybe a seat on an evacuation transport if the crisis deepened. But as the days grew colder and the skies turned gray with the smoke of dead engines, the word volunteer disappeared from the announcements. Every able-bodied citizen between 18 and 35 was now enlisted in the Energy Reclamation Corps. Their mission was simple: reclaim whatever energy could be salvaged from the old world. Dismantle vehicles, strip ships for fuel cells, harvest solar panels, dig up the last reserves hidden beneath abandoned rigs. The irony was thick. The world that once ran on greed now ran on desperation. Among them was a 22-year-old mechanic named Elias Kane, drafted from the rusting suburbs of what used to be Detroit. He'd grown up fixing cars with his father, learning the sound of combustion like others learned music. But now, the hum of an engine was a relic. Elias didn't believe in the cause, he believed in survival. Each morning, he woke to the sound of military trucks, still fueled somehow, carrying conscripts deeper into the reclamation zones. Their uniforms bore the mark of the United Resource Federation, a coalition of surviving governments that promised order through obedience. Fuel credits replaced currency, and the black market thrived. There were whispers that the Federation still controlled a secret fuel reserve buried in Alaska, guarded by armed drones and bio-locked silos. Elias didn't know if it was true, but it didn't matter. His job was to tear apart the past, one machine at a time, while the officials built a future powered by the few who obeyed. The work was brutal. Crews dismantled what was left of the interstate fleets, buses, trucks, and military transports gutted for scraps of biodiesel or lithium residue. Drones hovered overhead, scanning workers for compliance. Anyone caught siphoning or hiding material was immediately reassigned, a word everyone knew meant disappearance. Still, the hunger for power, both literal and political, burned hotter than any engine. In the camp where Elias was stationed, he met Mara, a woman his age, sharp-eyed and unflinching, drafted from the eastern colonies. She didn't talk much about her past, only that her younger brother had been taken during the first wave of the draft and never returned. She'd joined to find him, not to serve. Together, they scavenged through the remains of a collapsed refinery, ghosts in a graveyard of rust. One night, under a sky dimmed by pollution and absence of light, Mara whispered that she'd found a map, coordinates hidden inside a broken terminal showing the location of Vault 9, a rumored facility where the Federation stored its real reserves. Elias didn't want to believe it. Believing meant hope, and hope was dangerous in a world ruled by ration cards and fear. But something in her eyes, fire mixed with sorrow, pulled him in. The next weeks were a blur of secret plans. They saved what little fuel they could, stealing drops from maintenance tanks, hiding it in hollow tools and air canisters. The risk was immense. Surveillance was everywhere. The Federation preached unity, but enforced it with drones and neural scanners. Each morning began with a broadcast from the Chancellor: fuel is the blood of civilization. To waste it is treason. To preserve it is patriotism. The words echoed through loudspeakers, a hymn to control. But Elias saw the truth. There was no preservation, only exploitation. The draft wasn't about rebuilding, it was about control. The more people were forced into labor, the fewer questioned the power behind the Federation's polished slogans. When Mara disappeared one evening during a salvage run, Elias knew something had gone wrong. Her ID tag was found near a burned checkpoint, and her name was erased from the daily logs. That night, Elias made his choice. If he stayed, he'd die slowly under the Federation's boot. If he left, he'd die quickly, but at least on his own terms. He packed his stolen fuel capsules, an old pistol, and the map Mara left behind. The coordinates pointed north, Alaska. Vault 9. The journey was madness. The roads were dead, the air frigid, the skies filled with the hum of patrol drones. But Elias moved at night, guided by instinct and desperation. Along the way, he met others, drifters, deserters, families on foot dragging their lives in carts. Some offered shelter, others betrayal. The world had turned feral. In abandoned towns, he saw posters urging loyalty to the Federation, report hoarders, earn credits, fuel the nation. Each one felt like a knife. After weeks of travel, frostbitten and half-starved, Elias reached the mountains of Alaska. There, hidden beneath the snow, he found it, a massive concrete structure guarded by automated turrets and electric fences. Vault 9. The air around it reeked of ozone and secrets. He observed for days, watching convoys of armored transports arrive and depart. They weren't carrying fuel to distribute. They were hoarding it, consolidating the last remaining reserves for the elite, the upper tiers of the Federation who lived in floating cities above the chaos. It was true, the people were starving and freezing while their leaders flew in skyward sanctuaries powered by stolen fuel. Rage replaced exhaustion. Elias infiltrated the facility through a maintenance shaft, crawling through metal corridors humming with generators. Inside, he saw tanks, massive reservoirs filled with crude and hydrogen, enough to power continents. And then he saw something worse. Rows of cryogenic pods, each labeled with names and ranks. Mara's name was there. She wasn't dead. She was part of an experiment. The Federation was preserving selected individuals, freezing them to repopulate the Earth once the crisis ended. Humanity's restart, chosen by power. Elias broke her pod open, reviving her with shaking hands as alarms blared. When she gasped for breath, her first word was, "Run." Together, they fled through the labyrinth as drones swarmed. But Elias had one last plan. Deep inside the control room, he triggered the emergency purge protocol, a failsafe designed to destroy the facility if breached. As the walls trembled and sirens wailed, he uploaded a signal to the remaining world networks, broadcasting the truth. The Federation has lied. The fuel exists. They're saving it for themselves. The message spread like wildfire across underground channels, igniting rebellions in camps across continents. The fuel riots began that night. Mara and Elias escaped through an emergency tunnel, watching from a distance as Vault 9 exploded in a column of fire and smoke that illuminated the frozen sky. The blast echoed across the tundra, a requiem for a dying world. But amidst the ruin, people rose. The draft collapsed, soldiers turned against their commanders, and the Federation's grip began to crack. For the first time in years, there was no order, just freedom, raw and terrifying. Elias and Mara became symbols of defiance, though they never sought fame. They wandered south, carrying the story of what they'd seen, spreading hope like contraband. The world would take decades to heal, but the truth was out. The end of fuel didn't mean the end of humanity. It meant rebirth. Months later, as the last of winter thawed, Elias stood on a hillside overlooking a valley where makeshift turbines spun in the wind. Children ran among solar arrays, laughter blending with the hum of new energy. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever would be, but it was alive. He looked at Mara, who was sketching the horizon in a tattered notebook. She smiled faintly and said, "Maybe this is how it should have been all along." Elias nodded, his gaze distant. The world had burned, but from its ashes came light, real light, not the artificial glow of domination, but the spark of renewal. Somewhere far above, the remnants of the Federation's cities drifted aimlessly, their fuel reserves useless without control. The irony made him laugh. Power had always been an illusion. What mattered now was connection. People powered people. Years passed, and the story of the draft became legend. Historians argued about its truth. Politicians tried to rewrite it, and survivors whispered about the man who lit the fire that ended the age of oil. Elias never cared for legacy. He lived quietly, fixing windmills and teaching children how engines once worked, not to restore the past, but to understand it. The last entry in Mara's notebook read, "The world didn't end. It simply ran out of excuses." And that, perhaps, was the greatest revelation of all, that scarcity had forced humanity to rediscover meaning. The fuel situation wasn't a disaster, it was a reckoning. When the last drop was gone, people finally realized that the real energy source had been each other all along. If this story made your heart race and your mind wander through the ruins of a world too close to our own, don't just scroll away. Tap like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this remind us that the future isn't written by those in power, but by those who dare to question it. Join the revolution of readers who still believe in truth, hope, and the spark that keeps humanity alive.